Good afternoon from the 1011 Now streaming studio. I'm Danielle Shenk. This is Inside the Story with the Flatwater Free Press, a nonprofit news organization in Nebraska that emphasizes investigations and feature stories. Today, we're sitting down with Natalia Alamdari, who's kicking off a new series called Nebraska Evolving. Now, before we were starting here, we were having some technical difficulties, so hopefully we can kind of get over those and get through this awesome interview that we're going to have with Natalia. So thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Alrighty, so kind of give us a quick overview of what your new series is about.
Yeah, so I am the Greater Nebraska reporter here at Flatwater Free Press. And one of the things that I was really interested in covering more this year is, who calls Greater Nebraska home? Who are the people who are living in these communities, who have maybe moved into these communities a bit more recently? And I kind of had this gut impulse of like, there are that have been left out of coverage of rural Nebraska, maybe communities that are overlooked that people living in Omaha or Lincoln might not expect. So I really was working with a lot of census data, kind of looking at, how have demographics shifted over time in greater Nebraska and grown? How have they declined? Who's moving into places around the state? So that was really kind of the inspiration for the project. So this first story was really looking at the numbers-based side of things, and the rest will be a bit more, feature-driven coming from those numbers. But this first story really looked at, what does the population of Greater Nebraska look like? And the main finding was that, if your community is growing, it is likely due to immigration. And that's in two forms. It's, people who maybe have moved to the state more recently, but also people who have moved to the state from another country, 20, 30 years ago. And then their second generation kids and third generation immigrants that come from that, how have generations of families shaped a place? So this first story looked at the statewide numbers, but focused in on the community of Wakefield, where this is the exact dynamic that's been happening. You had people who moved to Wakefield for work about 30 years ago. Now their kids live there. Their kids are in schools. And you still have people moving to Wakefield from different countries, like into the present day, coming from parts of Central America for the most part.
Yeah, and so your article has some pretty nifty maps here in this first part. Can you kind of tell us what these maps depict?
Sure. So this first set of maps is showing the counties in Nebraska that saw population increase from 2010 to 2020. So 24 counties in the state saw an increase in population. And we wanted to focus on the counties outside of Omaha and Lincoln just to kind of get a sense of what things look like in greater Nebraska. So if you take out Sarpy, Lancaster, and Douglas County, that's still 21 counties that increased in population over those 10 years. In 16 of those counties, 100% increase was because of the number of people of color living in those counties, whether that's from people moving in, people having children, a combination of both. It really was people of color driving population growth in those counties.
Right, and so there are several rural communities experiencing this impact of immigration, just as you were talking about. And you kind of mentioned earlier that Wakefield is the focus of this first article. Can you kind of tell us why you chose them?
Yeah, I think Wakefield, I can't remember how I first decided. I think it had come up in a conversation with someone just talking about the state in general. And I think they might have brought up Wakefield schools of like, oh yeah, they've like kind of had to figure out how to work with more English learner students and, figure out staffing when it comes to that sort of thing. And I was like, you know what, let me call up someone in Wakefield. And so I ended up having a really great conversation with someone in town about, all the businesses along Main Street that are Latino owned, the number of people working at Michael Foods in town. That's a egg product production plant that really employs a huge number of people in
Mm-hmm.
town. And also the way the dealing with the school being this situation that not a lot of schools that are your student population is growing. There's no fear of like consolidation or losing a school or anything like that. But there is that added challenge of what happens if we run out of space? Like, how do we deal with a building that wasn't made for this number? Still, people who see the value and the benefit of what is happening population wise in Wakefield, and also kind of trying to think through, how do we deal with the challenges that might come from this, whether it's, school size or housing availability, things like that.
Yeah, and I mean, all good things that you've been touching on. Can you also add to how immigration is really helping shape these towns into what they are becoming now?
Yeah, I think it's kind of twofold. I think if you look at schools, that is a really interesting place to kind of understand how immigration shapes a place. Um, and that's kind of what I'm hoping to dig deeper in on a future story. But one of the things that really kept on being told to me in Wakefield is like, oh yeah, if you look at the school, like those kids aren't, they're not thinking about race, they're not thinking about immigration, like they're all friends, they all play on the same teams together. um, and just really seeing how something that maybe years ago would have seemed really new to a place and unknown is now just like very normalized in town. And it's just really interesting. I think the place. The other thing that is interesting to me is, how it shapes business. So that was one of the things I focused on in Wakefield. If you just walk down Main Street, there are so many different businesses that are owned by either people who moved here from Mexico 30 years ago or their children that are now adults. And to kind of see how that shapes a place. I've driven through a lot of main streets in Nebraska. Some of them are busier than others, or more. So is new awnings. Like they've really put a lot of attention into trying to keep their main street like very vital and active. One of the photos you just scrolled past, I wanted to highlight the only grocery store in Wakefield where you can get fresh produce right now is the Mexican grocery store that's been there for about 25 years or so. So like if you want to get produce, you either have to drive to or you go to the grocery store in town.
Mm-hmm. And so, as we've kind of been talking, this has been on rural Nebraska focus. And so, how stark is the difference when you take out Douglas and Sarpy County and the counties that really house Omaha and Lincoln? I mean, how noticeable is that difference?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the difference really shows how um, the population changes in rural Nebraska. Immigrants and their families have kind of stabilized what could have been a more drastic population decline. So one of the numbers that jumped out to me as I was reporting this was if you look at the census data from 2010 to 2020, rural Nebraska saw a population decline of about 1,200 people total. But then if you look at how the number of people of color changed in rural Nebraska, that increased by almost about 48,000 people. So you can really see like how that group of Nebraskans is very much stabilizing a population decline that could have been a lot larger.
Right. And so you interviewed quite a few people about their stories about immigrating to Nebraska. So, what was that like gaining that new perspective from these immigration families?
Yeah, it was reading. I myself, my family, I have family members who immigrated to the US, but we ended up in a big city. So we ended up in Houston. That's a much different experience from ending up in, Wakefield or Columbus, much smaller communities. And it was just really interesting that perspective from people. I'm trying to remember specifics from the conversations I've had. Yeah, it was just to talk to people. One thing that I is, just what people love about living in their town and what makes them decide, I want to raise my kids here. And that was really echoed in a lot of conversations that I had with folks whose families had moved over here, like back in the 90s and the early 2000s, like the reasons why they decide to stay. Like, this is a good place to raise my kids. I have my business, things that you really hear in all different corners of the state.
Mm-hmm. And so why does this impact of immigration matter to Nebraska?
Well, it matters in a couple of different ways. And this is all, what was communicated to me through reporting the story. Having a stable population, having a growing population in communities that historically have been experiencing population decline, like having a certain people in your certain access to different healthcare grocery stores, whether or not your school is going to stay open, like all of those different things that make a community and make a thriving community are really tied to, do you have people living there? Do you have people in this space to resources and use the resource there? Like an example in Wakefield, in almost every Nebraska town I go to, not lately, the entire time I've worked at Flatwater, the thing you always hear about is housing. Housing is the big struggle. We don't have anywhere for people to live. Wakefield was just able to add new units as their demand people working. And frankly, because Michael Foods was committed to paying a security deposit for their employees that ended up working there, if there wasn't that population base and if there wasn't that industry base, would those 60 units have gone up? And even in Wakefield, all those 60 are filled up. At least the last time I checked in, like there is immediate demand for those places. I feel like there was somewhere else I was going to go with this. A lot of what was told to me was, having immigrants and their families move into Nebraska towns over the past however many years, that makes a difference for the businesses that are already existing. It makes a difference for the businesses those families will create, which is what we see in Wakefield. And also just, culture and community, people being able to learn more about other people's customs and cultures across the board. That was something that folks at the school talked a lot about. And there's something else I was going to say tied to this, but yeah, that really is kind of the gist of everything told to me throughout this whole reporting process.
Yeah. And I mean, Wakefield seems like a really good first example for you in this story, in this series that you're starting here in Nebraska Evolving. So what's the next step? Where are you headed to next, or what's next for this series?
Sure. The next place I'm going to be spending some time in Columbus on Friday. That's kind of more of a statewide story, but gonna visit with some folks in Columbus. Where else? Schuyler is on my list. South Sioux City, and maybe some other places. We'll see. Those are the ones that are set in stone in my head at the moment.
But it seems like a good roadmap. You're going to be exploring a lot of Nebraska with this. Are you excited for this series?
Yeah. I think it's something I've been piecing together over the past year or so. I feel like throughout all the conversations I've had for this first story.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty. Well, thanks so much for joining us here, Natalia.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Alrighty, so we've only scratched the surface of this first article in her news series, Nebraska Evolving. I encourage you to take a much closer look. It's available on 1011now.org or .com or flatwaterfreepress.org. For more news and updates, visit our website and follow us on all our social platforms. From our newsroom to wherever you are, see you on the next stream.